Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the briefing room. Yes, indeed, it is Tuesday at 4 o'clock Eastern. That is the show time for the program that is designed to strip away all that marketing stuff and get down to the brass tacks of what these enterprise technologies are in the field of information management, what they do, how they work, with the whole purpose being to help you out there in the real world figure out which tools may be appropriate for you. So my name is Eric Cavanaugh. I'll be your moderator for today's event. And folks, this is a really interesting topic. I'm very glad that we got these guys to step into the briefing room today because it's a very interesting concept we're going to be talking about. And first of all, there's a slide about yours truly and enough about me. So the mission is to reveal the essential characteristics of enterprise software. And the way we do that is we pair vendors with independent analysts for live analyst briefings. And part of the magic is we do not have the analyst and vendor coordinate for the show simply because we want the kind of organic conversation that occurs when a vendor is giving a briefing to an analyst. So we build a format around that, and the format has me talking first, then the vendor going for about 20, 25 minutes, and really trying to detail the technology to show you what it is, how it's designed, why it was designed that way. That's a big question we try to answer because the purpose behind a particular technology is obviously a driving force to how that technology is designed, how it's managed, how it's used over time, etc. So part of this whole magic here, though, is the audience questions. We tend to get very, very good questions from our audience, so please don't be shy. So December is Innovators Month. That's coming up. Big Data is January, and Analytics is February. These are very, very hot topics. And, of course, the topic for today is, in fact, big data. So let's kind of talk about this for a minute. The topic of the month is cloud, but what we're talking about is basically managing big data and using big data. Of course, we've heard all about big data. It has got to be the absolute hottest topic in the world of information technology these days, at least in the world of data management and information management. The formal title is 3 Keys for Making Big Data User-Friendly. Well, folks, being in the analyst space, we take lots and lots of briefings of technologies. And I have looked at probably 25 or 35 different technologies over the past year and a half focused on big data. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff, a lot of very powerful technology, but I can tell you that much of the stuff I've seen, although it can be used efficiently to do amazing things, is not very user-friendly. Some of these tools definitely require power users who really understand several different facets of data management, and these are rare people. And you've heard this term data scientist thrown around, and we did a webcast with Mark Madsen and Hortonworks a few weeks ago in which he said that basically a data scientist is a unicorn. It's an incredibly rare creature. It's a beautiful creature. When you find them, pay them a lot of money, keep them happy because they're going to do wonderful things for your company, but they are rare. And so typically what happens is you wind up with a team of people at an organization, someone who really understands how to identify and maybe integrate data sources, somebody who really understands the business problem, the context, someone who may understand better how some of these tools work for manipulating data, for working with big data. Well, the company we have in the briefing room today, Alteryx, they've been around for several years. They had a different name. They changed names a couple years ago. And I have to say, when we looked at the platform that they had designed, it was one of the best jobs I've seen yet of creating a user interface that is, in fact, intuitive and that has workflow built into it. I think this is one of the missing components in user interface design that we're now starting to see, I think, in part because of the whole social media revolution, because of tools like Twitter, for example, or Bitly, or LinkedIn, or some of these other tools out there that have really focused on trying to make it extremely easy for some consumer to understand which button to push and when. Because if you think back, and one of the examples I'll give about what I would consider a fairly poor user interface would be like Adobe Premiere. Now that's basically for audio editing and other types of it might do video editing as well these days, but it's a very, very difficult user interface. I mean, you could spend hours, if not days, just reading the manual and still have no idea where to go, how to do things. Very, very complicated. And granted, it's complicated stuff, but we're now starting to see this focus on user interface, and I was pleased to see that Robin Bloor, in his recent article, 10 Laws of IT, commented that user interface is the most important part of an application. Now, you could argue that under the covers, you need to have the plumbing correct and all that stuff, no doubt about it. The stuff has to work, but that interface the layer through which you interact with your data, you interact with your application, you interact with the outside world can just make or break the usefulness of a technology. So we're going to talk about that today. All right, so the analyst is John Myers. He's a senior analyst over at Enterprise Management Associates. He's been in the briefing room before, so he knows how things go. Alteryx, you can see they have an enterprise-class analytics platform. They're talking about humanizing big data, and they also talk about data artisans. So we're going to learn about both of those today. There's Paul Ross. He has 14 years of experience, as you can see, and he worked at Business Objects at Microsoft. So he's really been around, and he's seen a bunch of different companies, and that can be very useful information in the world of enterprise software because you understand how things are done at different companies. You learn some lessons about maybe how to articulate your vision, how to get messages across. It can be useful stuff to have that kind of experience. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Paul Ross of Alteryx. And Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for having us today on the show. I think some of the things that you were saying there were really important in terms of how we think about this kind of emerging and now actually very important area of big data. And that's purpose. The purpose of Alteryx is very clearly defined for us to help what we describe as the data artisan. So this is the person who is the business or the data analyst in the line of business environment who actually is driving the decision-making process for that organization. So we talk about strategic analytics, so solving the big problems that are faced by the head of sales, the head of real estate, the head of marketing, the head of HR, head of finance, as they make strategic decisions. And that's really the purpose of what we do, is enabling that data artisan to help solve for those critical decisions. And we really take it quite seriously in terms of how that translates into our products and what we deliver to customers. And I think that really also flies nicely in with this concept of big data. Clearly, as we look at big data as a whole, there's been a huge amount of buzz that have been driving engagement from press, analysts, vendors, everybody in terms of this. But what we're starting to see now, and I think this will be reflected in what John has to say later, is that this is becoming very much real within organizations. We have customers who have actual key deployments of Hadoop, of MongoDB, of their existing data warehousing environment where they are capturing and storing and using what's now become known as big data. So the buzz is definitely there, but interestingly, what we're now seeing, and we saw this in a survey that we recently conducted with the Economist Intelligence Unit, that this is becoming very real, but not just from an IT perspective. I think what we've seen a lot of up till now is IT groups and data management groups deploying a new data environment with a Hadoop cluster, with a MongoDB deployment, with whatever it is that they've been using to start to capture these new sources of information and insight. But interestingly, what our survey showed was that when we looked and asked the business decision makers within organizations, what we found was that they saw real value. So the first point on this particular slide really calls out the fact that big data insight makes better informed decisions. So that's I think a change that we'll be seeing as the next year unfolds, as this becomes much more of a business decision and much more of a business discussion than just purely a data discussion. And the other part of this, which is quite interesting, especially as we bring together these two concepts of cloud and big data, is that 74% of our respondents actually said that more sharing of data, and specifically big data, into putting it in the hands of the right people is actually going to deliver more effective decisions. Now, both of these things are relatively, you could see and answer these questions yourself and believe that those statements would be true. But the key thing here is the transition that we're seeing from IT to the business in terms of the outcomes here. And if anyone wants to look at more of the report, we actually have this on alteryx.com, as well as an infographic outlining the details of this, which we'll also touch on in a moment. So we have this reality of buzz, but now we're starting to get to the point where the business is looking to get engaged. The challenge, though, and this kind of reflects back to, Eric, your point around the data scientist. There's lots and lots of specific investment being made in individual people and individual projects around big data. So people putting in a Hadoop cluster, specifically in the retail environment as an example, to enable them to get access and very rapid access and very large-scale access to point-of-sale execution. So that's great, but how do you actually take that data and engage it with the rest of the context in your organization? How do you take the varied and very different sets of information and get it into the hands of the business decision maker in the right way? And what we actually found when we looked at the results of the survey, and you see here a little screenshot from the infographic that we put together, that was actually the key thing that people talked about, was that the value of big data is really going to come when it's analyzed in the context of other sources of data. So doing a singular project where you have a big data deployment of some sort, and on top of that you have a custom application that you've built maybe in Java using MapReduce, is going to be very important for that individual project. But where the real value comes in is sharing that information and blending that information with things like customer intelligence, customer segment data, all of these types of other sources of data that reside within all of the other areas of the data infrastructure for an organization is absolutely key to the success or failure of this. And this has been Alteryx's approach for many years. Eric was talking about the changes that we've made to our platform. But there's a couple of things that we've always maintained during that time, and the first of which is to focus on our ability to bring together lots of different types of data into one place. If we take VF Corp, a really good customer of Alteryx for a number of years, they're a CPG brand, so they own brands like the North Face, Vans, etc. And what they've been doing is blending lots of different types of data together to provide deeper value to their retail network. So their Macy's North Face store-in-store model. How do they get more value and help those retail networks sell more of their products? Well, they do that through blending together point-of-sale data, deeper sales information, broader market demographics, customer demographics, to provide that deeper engagement within their environment, optimize their sales, optimize their product mix, and then, of course, optimizing the risk around overstock, key critical point around the CPG marketplace. Another great example of a customer who's been doing very insightful things with their data is Southern States. So Southern States are actually a very different type of organization that not many people, I think, on this call will have heard of. They actually provide farming supplies, so things like cattle feed. And they do that primarily through their catalog model. So incredibly different type of business than somebody who's completely social media based and cloud based. But what they've been doing is, again, they've been blending data types together, being able to apply predictive analytics on top of that, and therefore optimize their marketing response rates. So this is not only about, they can get more return on their existing investment, they can actually optimize that investment by reducing the number of catalogs, et cetera, that they're sending out. So more traditional marketing, but still very important in terms of applying some of these key concepts of blending different types of data and putting them in the hands of decision makers. And then, of course, we have customers like AT&T who are using us to look at the massive volumes of engineering and customer and market data that they have to do things like reducing churn, streamlining their population analysis, optimizing based on that population analysis and churn analysis, how they utilize their equipment. So these are three, classic customers of Alteryx who are doing the things that we need to be able to deliver into the kind of big data context. And Eric, raised a very good point around the concept of data artisans. And, this is something that we strongly believe in, which is that data scientists in organizations are going to really help drive the state of the art forward. But the real value for us and the scale of value for us is really going to come through taking some of those core skills, such as accessing big data, taking advantage of in-database analytics, and being able to utilize some of the more advanced predictive and statistical capabilities without forcing them to go through a huge amount of retraining. If you were to go out on LinkedIn and count the number of people out there with a job title of data scientist, I'm sure you'll see a large number of people who are newly minted as data scientists, but you'll see hundreds of thousands of business and data analysts. So we want to take those people's understanding of data, understanding of the business, and enable them with an analytics platform, and that's what Alteryx is really all about. And we're really focused on three key things when we think about that audience, their value to the organization, and what we want to do with big data. So the first of which is We want to get big data insights into the hands of the business user now, not later. So not when IT have been able to do a large-scale integration project. We want to be able to provide these business and data analysts, our data artisans, with the right capabilities to make use of that data and to make use of the more advanced, sophisticated, predictive and statistical analytical capabilities. And third, and potentially most importantly, when we think back to that economist data, the economist intelligence unit data, we want to make the consumption of big data analytics as easy as the apps that a business decision maker uses at home. You know, we're talking about this consumerization of big data. It's absolutely critical in terms of making the value that we can get from this as widely used as possible. And that's where Alteryx Strategic Analytics 8.0 comes in. This is the latest platform and solution from Alteryx. And we'll see in a moment is really based on two key components, a production environment and a consumption environment. And what Alteryx AO is really all about is three key things. The first of which is to be leading this concept of consumerizing big data analytics. And we'll show how we do that through our analytics gallery solution. The second one is by providing a platform that's as fast and for designing and publishing analytic applications and workflows than anything else on the marketplace today. So the idea here really is to make sure that that business and data analyst can provide a response into their business as rapidly as possible. And then finally, it's about utilizing all of the relevant data, not just one particular component, not just big data or not just internal data warehousing data or cloud data, being able to utilize all of it. And it also includes the ability for us to provide package data. You know, we saw earlier in the results of our survey the importance of being able to blend data with market data, with customer intelligence, with demographic data. And that's something that we're very much focused on. And in terms of the way that we deliver that, Eric talked about the workflow approach. And that's really how we envisage all of our capabilities. The starting point is all of the relevant data that we have, being able to integrate that data into an analytical data set, and then enhancing it with unique package market and customer data. We actually ship with every license of Alteryx Professional a range of data for demographic, firmographic, spatial, as well as segmentation data from these key data vendors you can see here on the screen. We then allow the data artisan to take that, once they've actually been able to bring that data together, to build the analytics on top of it, and do that in a way that's much, much more accessible than the normal approach to doing these things. So not having to rely upon a statistics PhD in order to do customer clustering and customer segmentation as an example. And once we've enabled that data artisan to build out that flow, being able to then publish it, put it in the hands of business decision makers, allowing self-service access and kind of self-delivery of insight through analytical applications, so that they can get to the specific analytic output they're looking for, whether it's a demographic analysis in a specific location, whether it's an understanding of customer behavior, whatever the analytic output is, it's delivered through this model of the analytic application. And we'll see how we build out those in a moment. So in terms of our kind of core architecture, as I said before, we really think about this as a production and consumption environment. So the key roles involved in using our product clearly are the people who are maintaining the sources of data, the systems of record in IT and the data warehousing environment, whether that's through specific data warehousing models, NoSQL databases, Hadoop, or big data discovery capabilities like Teradata Astra. Or if it's even the local documents that are on a data analyst or business analyst desktop. Think about how often customer segmentation is likely to exist in an Excel spreadsheet. And so being able to take advantage and ingest all of that data, apply all of our data integration capabilities as well as the analytical capabilities on top of it, plus take advantage of things like in-database analytics, for example, with Teradata, we'll talk about that in a moment, as well as being able to actually output into whatever format as well. So we have a number of customers who utilize us to push data back into their analytical data warehousing environment, or use us to produce an analytical data set to be consumed by a third-party capability, something like Tableau. And so what we're able to do is utilize this approach to then build the analytic workflow that gets distributed either as a specific file format or as an analytical application in the model that we're actually going to look at in a moment. So that's the kind of core approach that we take in terms of the product as a whole. And so what I'm going to do now is actually shift to a demonstration so that everyone can get a feel for what Alteryx is actually capable of doing and some of the key concepts like that workflow model that we were talking about previously. So I'm now going to go ahead and share my desktop. If I can have somebody confirm that they can see it. They can. Excellent. Thank you. So what I'll actually start off with is we'll start off with the consumption environment. I mentioned the two models, the consumer and the producer of analytic environment. And what we're going to start off here is with the Alteryx Analytics Gallery. This is our brand new public cloud environment for the sharing and use of analytical applications. So if you imagine that I work for Alteryx, it's not a hard thing for you to imagine, but what we have here is the Alteryx environment for accessing analytic applications. And what happens is that the data artisan is going to go ahead and publish their analytic applications into this secure environment that only my organization can get access to. Only the people I've said can have access to can go ahead and do that. And I publish these various analytic applications into this environment, what we call our studio. You can see here we have a number of different types of analytics here. We have a trade area curator, a prospecting analysis, a variety of different types of things that are both been produced by Alteryx and by some of our partners as well. And this environment, as I said before, is very much driven by the model of sharing some of the social media experiences that we all share. So we also have the ability to curate content. So I can go ahead and I can take an analytic application and I can actually put it into a collection for end users to be able to access. So here's my retail app collection, my marketing analytic application collection. You can see here who I've enabled to get access to this as well. So this concept of curation is very important in the world, again, reflecting how people are used to consuming information within their Pinterest or whichever other social media environment that they actually use. But let's go ahead and find an analytic application that's going to match our requirements today. Let me just close down this intro content here and do a search for Salesforce. One of the key things that we recently released in 8.0 was a connector for Salesforce. So we can actually go and access data out of Salesforce, something that's very complicated for a lot of organizations, including us here at Alteryx until we have this capability. And what this analytic application allows us to do is actually look at the performance of our salespeople over time. Now here at Alteryx, we actually only recently moved to Salesforce earlier this year, and so only this year's data is actually available within the Salesforce environment here. And so what we've had to do is we've had to build an analytic application that blends data from our existing Salesforce deployment as well as from our previous environment. So this analytic application allows a business user to get access to that process. So I'm just going to click Run here, and now that's going to go away and go against our data and pull back information regarding their performance. And you see here that this report is running here, but just as that's running, I'm going to open up a one that's been run previously. And you can see here we can output into a number of different formats. It could be an HTML document, which we'll have a look at in a moment for a different app, an Excel spreadsheet, or a PDF. So I'm going to click on the PDF to give you an idea of what that actually is going to go ahead and look like. And here you can see the data for our salespeople in terms of their year-to-date performance, but importantly, as I said before, the year-over-year comparison by quarter. And that's a relatively straightforward report that many organizations would want to be able to deliver. But again, you think back to our challenge here is that we had data in Salesforce, and then we had data in an old legacy database. And we didn't want to wait for or even force our IT department to do the integration of that data from those different data sources. So what we did is we built an Alteryx analytic application that brings together that data. Let me just quickly switch over to the Alteryx Designer. So we looked at the production environment. Now we're going to look at we looked at the consumption environment. Now we're going to look at the production environment. And just to get you familiar with our environment as a whole, this is the Alteryx Designer desktop. Over here on the left-hand side, I have a variety of different tools that I can drag and drop into my workflow, which is on this canvas here in the middle. And you can see here we actually have one of our sample workflows here on display. This is actually a a way for you to understand the performance of, or likelihood, excuse me, of a particular audience to donate to an individual nonprofit based on a number of criteria where we're doing, in this case, some scoring using some predictive analytics. So we have a variety of different tools, input tools where we can go against all sorts of different types of data source. I'll just click on this one and you can get an idea of the different types of data sources that we can go against, as well, the standard ODBC pieces, as well as things like Hadoop deployments as well. We have a MongoDB tool here up on the top here. And we also have a number of different other aspects of accessing data. We also have, I mentioned this earlier, the predictive capabilities that we've embedded within the product. So over here on the left-hand side, you can see the predictive macros. Now what we've done here is we've actually taken R, embedded it into our product, and we can actually drag and drop an R tool. If you're capable of scripting in R, we can allow you to do that. But what we've done is we've abstracted away from R as well. And what we've done is we've created these predictive macros and tools to allow this to be a much, much more straightforward process. So if you were to take, for example, the scoring component tool here, to do that within R would obviously take you a number of lines of code. You'd have to be familiar with the approach for doing it. Instead, what we've done is we've packaged that up and made it much more accessible. So all you need to know is I need to score this, and then you can configure that using the configuration box over here on the right-hand side to make sure that you're actually using this in the right way. So you still need to understand which of these models that you want to be able to use, but we make it much, much more accessible than forcing you to be a predictive stats PhD or waiting for somebody with that role to give you back the model that you're actually looking for. So let's just return back to our Salesforce report as we were looking at previously. So this is actually the module that we use here internally at Alteryx. And as you can see here, we have the ability to go and access the Salesforce data using this specific connector. But we're also accessing data from our HR system. So specifically, we're getting data about when an individual salesperson started with Alteryx. And so what we're able to do is blend that data together to start to get an understanding of how they are performed based on their peer group comparison, et cetera. So let's just go back to that Salesforce connector for a moment. Up here on the right-hand side, hopefully everyone can see the configuration box for this. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly click on here to give you an idea of the tables that we're actually accessing here at the Alteryx Salesforce deployment. And so this is something that is quite a big pain for organizations to do, is to go and grab data out of Salesforce for analytical purposes beyond the existing analytics that are in Salesforce itself. So this gives you an idea of the types of things that we're able to bring together. And then the last piece just to highlight here is our ability to bring together data from that legacy system that we previously used in place of Salesforce for Salesforce automation. And the rest of this module workflow here, you can see that we're bringing data from there. We're doing some cleansing. We're doing some formula. We're filtering, and then we're applying a number of statistical and predictive models on there to give us the final output, which is actually used by our head of sales here, outlining the seller performance based on how they're performing against their quota, and as I said at the start, how they're performing against previous years as well. So a relatively simple requirement that without the ability for us to blend data directly within a single workflow and then do analytics on top of it would have forced us to wait for a longer-term IT project to integrate the data from previous years into our Salesforce deployment, something we didn't want to spend the time or spend the money actually doing. Now, I mentioned earlier the different types of output that we can deliver in Alteryx. We've looked at Excel, we've looked at PDF. One of the interesting things is we can actually also output as HTML, as you would expect with a lot of business intelligence capabilities. We can actually output as HTML as well. And here we've built a specific, almost like a reporting pack for a business decision maker. And in this case, we're actually looking at retail information. Now, what's special about this particular report is that it reflects the reality for a lot of organizations. I talked previously about Salesforce and legacy data systems, but lots of organizations have very complex data management infrastructures where they're maybe now deploying a Hadoop cluster. They're maybe taking advantage of one of the analytical databases. They want to be able to integrate third-party data, as I outlined previously. And this is actually a great example of that. In a single report here, in a single workflow, what we've built out is a real deep understanding of what's driving the sales of in this case, an online store for sports goods in a particular geographical and demographic area. So we're blending our data around our website, which is actually being stored in Hadoop and analyzed in Aster, Teradata Aster. We're doing in-database analytics from a predictive and statistical perspective using Teradata's in-database analytical capabilities up here on the right-hand side. And then we're also blending data here to understand the demographic information. So we've taken the pre-packaged Alteryx demographic data and utilize that to append that onto our point-of-sale data, our web data, to really understand what's happening. So a great example of multiple types of analysis utilizing different elements of our data infrastructure being blended together using things like end-path analysis within Teradata Aster, using predictive and statistical modeling, using the in-database analytical capabilities, as well as blending together the demographic information. And again, this just really was built using the same model as we've seen previously, a workflow. So if I were to move over to this particular workflow, you can see here we have a lot more steps involved, but it's still the same concept. Each tool links to the next tool to deliver that workflow model that Eric was talking about previously. You can see here we've highlighted how we're utilizing the Teradata Aster information where we have the specific end-path analysis that's happening, as well as later on in the model here we were doing some specific work directly against the Teradata database as well. So overall, this just gives you an idea of that workflow approach that we utilize. I'm really focusing in on the first key point that we were raising around the analytics gallery, around our ability to make the consumption of big data analytics as straightforward and easy to use as the apps that people use at home. To have a platform that enables people to very rapidly build analytical workflows, analytical applications without having to wait for long IT integration projects, and then being able to take advantage of all of the different types of data that people actually utilize or need to utilize when answering some of the key critical questions that our organizations are facing and given the reality of their data environment. So with that, I'm going to hand the session back to Eric. Eric, if you can take it back over here.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, John, I just made you the presenter. If you want, click on that tab, top middle BR12. There you go. And just use the down arrow to go through your slides.
All right. Just to cover over that, Paul, I don't know. This is where you can get this information about the Alteryx platform, and want to make sure we gave your slide its due there, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, John. I forgot about that one.
You're welcome. So my name is John Myers. I'm the Senior Analyst for Business Intelligence and Data Warehousing at Enterprise Management Associates. And EMA recently did an end-user study, a survey, where we started looking at what are some of the changing definitions of big data. I think one of the things that we've all kind of been conditioned for, and Paul, I think you covered this a little bit in your excellent presentation, is, you know, big data is this big voluminous thing, and a lot of times we equate it with one particular platform, but big data is really changing from a technical definition into much more of a business definition, as you talked about before. And I think that some of the evidence of this is when you see magazines like CFO magazine, when you see The Economist, when you see the Harvard Business Review, all talking in terms of big data. These are not, you know, technical journals, and they're not talking about how do you Hadoop or how do you do one particular area, things of that nature. You know, we're starting to talk about what is the business value of using big data, in particular, as you talked about big data in a particular context. The EMA study, one of the things that we focused on was not just saying, you know, do you have a Hadoop? How big is your Hadoop? What are you doing with your Hadoop? But we basically laid out to our respondents that, you know, this is the overall kind of concept of big data, things that require a certain level of response, volume, complex analysis, and then we let people kind of tell us what platforms are they using. And we found that they're using everything from point-of-sale systems to pull information from their transactional level, or even look at a much deeper level than that. Traditional enterprise data warehouses and data marts to pull information from a structured perspective. Moving into document data stores like JSON and other things, and then also using cloud-based sources. And I was very pleased to see Paul mention cloud-based sources, because I think that one of the keys of cloud-based sources is that they oftentimes will change their data layouts, or you don't necessarily get to see all of the data layout associated with a cloud-based platform unless you're using a particular, database as a service, if you will. But you're going to be looking at data in a whole different way. You're going to be looking at it from particular formats and things of that nature. So big data just isn't a Hadoop. It's this combination of all of these platforms put together. What we call this at EMA is the hybrid data ecosystem, where we put, instead of the platform in the center, we put the requirements in the center of this particular architecture, where we say the platforms that are all around us are the things that are going to drive or serve the requirements that we have in the center in terms of load, structure, response, complex workload, and something I think we haven't really talked about for quite some time is the economics of it. Making sure that what we want to do is something that we can do that meets either our business case or meets our business model for our organization or our industry. And people are using these requirements to do all sorts of interesting concepts. We're looking at trying to create competitive advantage by speed, being able to say, are we the fastest one to market with our analytics or our operational processing? Being able to develop a certain amount of competitive advantage from being able to look across the breadth of the data sources that we have available to us. And there's no one platform that can rule them all in this particular perspective, but what I think is very important here is that it's how do you link the data on all these, and this kind of harkens back to the slide that Paul had, where you have all these different data sources and you need to be able to bring them together in a particular way. And I think that the hybrid data ecosystem dovetails nicely with what Alteryx is trying to do. We also found out that big data isn't just big. It has many different structural components that go along with it. We've always thought about big data being unstructured data loaded into a Hadoop, or that's traditionally the way that people have thought about it. But we've got big data in terms of, if you look up here in the upper left, we see that the concept of video information streaming in, either whether it be from security cameras, whether it be from quality in a manufacturing environment, we have that particular piece. We have the ubiquitous social media content from Facebook and Twitter. We also see big data coming in terms of forms or legal documentation that we need to do. So we're not just thinking of it in terms of petabytes of unstructured data, but we're thinking about it in terms of this large collection of multi-structured data sources. And I think Paul did a good job of pointing out that the Alteryx platform has the ability to go and get those based on the connectors that they have available. And these big data platforms have multiple uses. They're not just being used for batch processing of data. We're seeing big data platforms being used in operational contexts. We're seeing them being used in terms of analytical contexts, and we're also seeing them being used in terms of exploratory sandbox type environments. And there are different users for all of these things. It's not just, shall we say, a data scientist, or in terms of what we talked about earlier, in terms of that, the Mark Madsen said a data scientist is a unicorn. We're seeing data scientists getting access to this data, but we're seeing a much larger constraint being the folks who are line of business executives and people who are regular business analysts, the data artisans that Paul has described, are having access into these data sets, whether they be used operationally, analytically, or in terms of a sandbox environment. Well, so that's kind of, where I see the marketplace for big data and big data platforms, big data management, particularly how you put these things all together. And then now I'm going to ask some questions of Paul, and so we'll see how they go. Let's see here. Paul, one of the considerations that I had, we talk about the EMA hybrid data ecosystem. How do you view the future of big data integration between these various nodes, whether it be NoSQL like Mongo or Hadoop, or structural data sources like an EDW or Datamart?
That's a great question, John, because I think your analysis of this as a set of nodes making up the kind of the data ecosystem, even within a single organization, is very accurate. And what we see is even with organizations who are even looking to standardize within an individual vendor, the reality is that they're still moving data around these in different places. And for me personally, I think this is about the almost the half-life of data as to where it gets stored and why it needs to get moved around. But when we have a reality that it's critical for us to understand the customer as one example, then we have to understand all of the behavioral information that we can get access to, which is obviously purchase, loyalty card. But then we get into things like social media, website behavior, as you saw in the example that we had earlier. So I think that the reality is that data and that movement of data and things like the appending of data and the enrichment of data to get a fuller picture is going to be a key part. I do believe that it's still going to be a very varied ecosystem, though. I don't think that we can really get to the point where we are standardizing on a huge data warehouse and a huge big data infrastructure, whether they're fully integrated or not. I think there's still this reality of multiple sources and multiple types of data over time.
And when you're seeing this from your customers, are you seeing them moving data kind of as a full data set from one of these platforms to the other, or do you see them doing more of the movement of the result sets, say, doing some programmatic processing of data in a NoSQL environment like Hadoop, and then bringing those result sets over into a structured environment, or do you see like kind of wholesale moving of data sets from one platform to another?
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of the second one. I think a lot of the people out there we're heading towards a friend of mine described the early majority for these data sources. And so what we're finding is that people are still not moving everything en masse because there's not necessarily a need for that in the same way as there was previously, where we had the data warehouse as the system of record. That's no longer the case. So I think it's more of the former of what you were saying, where people are taking subsets of data, doing analysis on it, maybe applying that back into the original data set, and then taking the results and moving that into their more coherent system of records and environment. The classic example is customer segmentation. Customer segmentation now includes social media activity. And how do you get at that? You have to be able to analyze that behavior in some way and be able to then apply it into your core customer loyalty database, which exists somewhere else. So personally, we see more of the movement of the results, as you described it, than the wholesale movement of entire data sets.
Excellent, excellent. You and I personally have talked about the data artisan in the past, but one of the questions I hear a lot is, can this type of data scientist, data artisan, can they be made? I mean, do you find them in your organization, or do you have to go out and import data artisans into your company?
Well, and it's such a great conversation every time we have this, because I think that if you compare it with a data scientist as a starting point, the data scientists, as we described before, are so critical how we move this state of art forward, how we take advantage of these new technologies. We wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't for those people. But what we believe is that the data artisan is essentially the person who's in your organization already. You just need to be able to get them tools that are easier to use to deliver the more sophisticated analytics, to deliver these new sources of insight without having to force them to go down a retraining. So I think you can certainly find them in your organization. You can import them, I think. We see that within our customers, people who've been using Alteryx, moving from one organization to another as they've proven out their value as a real supporter of the business delivery of its goals. But I do think it's a different conversation. I've seen job advertisements for data scientists, which maybe convince me I'm in the wrong role because of how big those salaries are. And as an organization, that's not sustainable over time. So I think they have to be made within the organization or have to be evolved into within the organization rather than imported.
And I think you touched a little bit on this next question that I have in terms of ease of use. How important are you guys finding feedback from your customers, the importance of ease of use and being able to develop these data artisan resources in-house?
Yeah, it's actually a very important aspect of how we think about everything we do. If you go back to the example of earlier this year, we integrated R into the Alteryx platform. So we enabled people to be able to do R scripting or copy and paste existing R script into part of the Alteryx workflow at the appropriate point that it made sense for them. And that was really well received by our customer base. I think our user conference, which happens each year in March, actually coming up in Phoenix, and people can register for that at our website. The response that we had last year about R was incredible. But we knew that we weren't done there. We knew that we had to be able to take the same approach that we've taken for things like spatial processing, making it a drag and drop tool rather than a complex, purely specialist capability. And that's where the predictive and statistical R tools that are within the workflows that we were looking at earlier came from. We know that we need to add more, but it's a really strong starting point for making it much more accessible. So I think the evolution of these people to be able to get access to things that were previously only available to specialists, whether it's accessing big data, whether it's doing in-database analytics, whether it's doing predictive analytics, it's absolutely the core of the purpose of Alteryx.
Excellent, excellent. We've talked a bit about, putting big data into context, and that's generally in terms of putting combinations of structures within big data together. What's the most common, if you will, or most, the one that you see most often in terms of your implementations for the combination of big data structures? Is it structured to a multi-structured format? I would call that, what may have been called before unstructured data, but I always say there's some structure in it. It'll be randomly assigned bits. Or are you finding folks mashing together those multi-structured data sources against each other?
It's an interesting question. I think almost the answer is yes to all of the questions. But I think what we see most of is, especially with these new and emerging areas of insight, when we're starting to look at more deeper clickstream analysis and tying that to real customers, and where we're seeing social media start to step into a key indicator of customer behavior and intent. It tends to be taking these multi-structured or, well, as you said, unstructured data, parsing it out and then integrating it with existing structured data. It seems to be the key thing that people are looking to do right now. I think that there is going to evolve a point where we're starting to, as the data ecosystem within an organization evolves, where in one place you've got all of your website information, in another place you have all of your social media information. How are those things coming together? We'll see more of the unstructured to unstructured linking happening, but there's still almost always, when we talk to our customers, a key structural element that occurs. One of our customers actually is what would be described as a marketing service provider by us at least, a company called Ansera, and what they're doing is they're bringing together data from their social media campaigns that they're running for their clients, blending that data as an outcome in terms of the engagement they're getting, and then determining, okay, we did this social media engagement over here, this person engaged with us, had this type of sentiment, had this type of engagement with us. Did they actually go and purchase? Because we know that we have their data in our loyalty program, and we can see whether or not they bought the pizza that was part of the kind of social media campaign that we were driving for. So that's the types of activity that we're seeing a lot more of, is an understanding of, as we blend these sources of data, how do we tie it back to real outcomes for the organization in terms of sales, revenue, profit, loss, all of those types of things.
Excellent. This question is probably a little bit more to the business side or the process side of it. What are the keys to introducing big data, whether it be platforms, structures, volumes, into existing analytical and operational processes?
It's an interesting one because the key word you have in there is processes, and processes are about how people work and what they do. So it almost goes. I feel like it's about the ease of use. It's about that aspect of it. The other thing I think, though, is outside, if you think about it beyond the technology and beyond what we do as a technology vendor, I also think it's about how decision makers are using analytics. If you think about the impact of analytics on the recent presidential campaign, the technology that was in play there has been around for a number of years. It was just about how people were recognizing the usage model for that type of analysis. And that's what really is in place there. So I think that there's not only is there a need for us to continue to make these technologies more accessible, more widely utilized, put in the hands of these business and data analysts who represent the real drivers of decision making within organizations. But it's also about the people that they serve. How do we not only make it really easy for them to use, as you saw with the analytics gallery, but how do we help them to make decisions? How do we change how they view and manage the business as a core? I think that potentially is almost even a bigger challenge than just purely the technology.
Okay, excellent. No, and as I tweeted during the course of your demonstration, I'm an unabashed fan of the way that you guys, lay out those processes, because I think it's very important to not just understand, a particular result set, but how that data moved along that particular process. And I think from the first time I saw it with Dean a couple of years ago, with Dean and George, I've really enjoyed the way that you guys lay it out in terms of a process, and I think that's one
I always think about
key differentiators. So.
I always keep thinking about that as it's capturing analytical IP. It's the value of what these people do in these organizations, and are capturing it in that workflow so that it's repeatable, and it's also inspectable as well, because it's at any point in that you can see what's happening with the data, you can understand what's going on. And we're not forcing, a black box model onto anybody. So I agree with you. I think it's one of the most kind of less understood capabilities of Alteryx in terms of its value, and it really, I think, makes a big difference to how our users actually get value from what we do.
Yep. And I think we've alluded to my last question here a little bit earlier when you talked about R and predictive analytics. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Eric, and we'll take questions from our audience.
Okay, that sounds great. And Paul, I'm actually going to hand over the keys to you. And if you would bring up that screenshot that just shows the different kinds of apps, that app gallery, I think is what you call it.
Oh, the Alteryx Analytics Gallery. Yeah, let me go ahead and do that.
Yeah, because I think that's it's a useful visual as we talk through some of these questions. But we have a bunch of good questions here, so let me just go ahead and dive right in. One of the questions was about where the data is stored. So is there any particular database engine that you find works fairly well, or it just depends on the kind of data? I'm talking about where you actually store the Alteryx data. So, would it be traditional relational database? Could it be one of these new databases, MongoDB, something like that? What about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's a couple of aspects there. It looks like actually our WebEx connection here is frozen up a little, so I'm not sure if anyone's actually seeing my screen. Yeah, if you could maybe just put it onto the final slide from my part of the presentation, that'd be awesome. The data itself, as I replied to the person who's asking the question, we can deal with data in a variety of different ways. We do actually have basically a columnar database, which is effectively an in-memory database where we can kind of have a lot of the data attached to the workflow and attach it to the analytic application as well. But we can also stream data, which is something that's very useful when you're talking about very large data sets, being able to chunk through very vast volumes of data. So we have a number of the people who put together massive data sets. You think about Experian or a customer of ours. and they often use the kind of streaming capability to deal with the volume of data that they're challenged with. But we can take a couple of approaches. We can kind of have the data sitting as part of an analytic application once we've produced the specific analytic data set, or we can actually just stream it straight through the workflow to deliver an output. Obviously, it's going to depend if you're going to put that analytic application up in the cloud. We can also access data that's stored in, say, S3 to allow you to have whatever data set you want attached to that analytic application as well. But it just varies by customer as to how they deal with that.
Okay, good. Here's a very specific question, but it's a great one, and it can kind of allow you to expound a bit on the different kinds of unstructured data, or, of course, that term can be bandied about, and really all data has some structure. It's just not the typical structure that you see like in a relational database. Yeah. But let me throw this out. One of the attendees notes that our big data is genome sequencing data. Much of that data might be considered unstructured because there's a need to attempt assembly, which involves a family of assembly approaches. Could you kind of talk about that kind of complex data set, and what would you do? Are you already able to handle that, or would there be some preparation? If so, what would that look like?
That's a really interesting question. I have to admit, I'm not an expert in the right way to do genome analysis. But I do know that, as you said, that essentially does have a level of structured data attached to it. There's some level of structure that you can parse from that. I think we've done some work previously where we've taken some very specific and very almost, I would describe, exotic data sets and applied some kind of intelligence as to how to do the kind of structuring process that we're talking about. So obviously, when it's things like text, it's much more simpler. You do the parsing, you do chunking, you do fuzzy matching, you do all of those things that allow you to make more sense of it. I'd have to, one of our data artisans here at Alteryx would have to take a look at it. But I believe we would essentially look to build some kind of component of the workflow where we would apply some level of structure into the data for us then to be able to do the analytical components, and then maybe we'd use something like a Tableau or something similar as an output to visualize that, because obviously when you're talking about genome, you're talking about a very complex set of even visualizations that you're doing at the front end of it. But yeah, I think that would be the approach. Is we would apply a level of structuring process either directly or as part of the workflow through Alteryx, and then be able to do the analytics on it.
Okay, good. And there's another
Paul,
question here. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, just from my perspective, I think when we start bringing in genome sequence data that we're looking for, it's a lot like when we pull in information from weblogs. I mean, a lot of the information in while it's all important information for the genome, I think a lot of times what we're looking for particular patterns, we're looking for particular aspects of the data. So Paul's exactly right. What we need to do is think about it in the context of the analysis that we want to do, but that genome data is something that would be perfectly usable if we take some of these analytics, and instead of looking about call detail records from a telco environment or point of sale information from a retail environment, say, let's focus on this from a healthcare environment and start to look not just at the demographics of a particular patient, but start to look at what is some of their genetic makeup when we start to say what are the correlations between treatments and result sets.
Yeah, it's a really good way of thinking about it. I really like the point around the correlation of the context being there, and I think that's where data becomes useful. It's not in isolation, it's in context, and that applies across the board.
Good answer, good context too. I mean, the really interesting thing we're talking about here, of course, is fusing together these worlds. And typically, big data in the past, before we had a lot of these engines for managing it, was just contextual in someone's head, really. I mean, you could look at sources of what we now call big data and glean some context just to yourself, and then apply that as you kind of built applications or built queries or so forth. And that's actually a decent segue to another question. One of the attendees asks, or kind of comments on what you talked about as workflow looking like ETL, which is true. It's kind of like an ETL process, but asks, in which area do you actually manipulate queries and produce dashboards? And that's really on that consumption side you talked about, right?
Yeah, and I think if you think about the tool as a whole, we have the entire work. We believe fundamentally that this is all about workflow. It's about building that workflow, making it repeatable and iterative, which is something we haven't touched on, which is important as well, as how do I adapt it over time. But ultimately, we are focused on a line of business environment. So we are not going to be the platform for your enterprise-wide data integration requirements. That's not where we specialize. We specialize in bringing together the analytical data set that people are looking for, but then doing analytics on top of it. So starting off with, okay, I want to bring together all of my data from my different systems that tell me about my customers' behavior, blend that together, get to the point where I understand everything about what they've done, but then do the predictive or statistical modeling on top of that before choosing the output. And that output, as you said, could be an analytical application in the analytics gallery, or it could be a file that's outputted and then consumed in a third-party tool, like a specialized mapping tool or a dashboarding tool, something like the Tableau. We have a number of customers who actually use us to build their analytical data set and then have Tableau for their business users to do data discovery on top of it. So you've got a wide variety of different outputs. We looked at the HTML output for the example where we were looking at the online retail example, where we were specifically looking at website information, demographic information for the customers who purchased on that website and what was driving them in terms of the golden path for purchasing. That type of output is very easily delivered directly out of Alteryx, but you essentially have options as to how you do that.
Okay, good. And here's a really specific question, but a good one. What language can people program in using Alteryx? Do you have your own proprietary language, or you mentioned R, for example, has been incorporated?
Yeah, so we can take advantage of a couple of things, and we can call, if you've done a specific piece of modeling or statistical modeling or data modeling that you've done, we can call that as part of our workflow. Our core approach is a drag and drop. The user interface that you saw, which is based around the tools of the workflow that we're doing it. So it's not primarily about programming, but we can call, scripts that you've built. As we pointed out, you can do scripting in R, which allows you to do a lot of analytical capabilities directly within there, or just take advantage of the tools that we've built on top of R to enable that. So it really is somewhat up to the user as to how they do that. The majority of our users aren't going to be doing scripting in anything other than potentially R as the core, or they'll take advantage of other people's scripting for specific, maybe where they have a very strange and complex blending of data or manipulation of data that's can only be done through some kind of specific scripting. But we can call that as part of the workflow. It could just be another step in there. Okay,
good. And we got a couple people talking about streams, and you mentioned streams. Can you just talk about how those types of data sets are used? Because, of course, that's very different from loading a static data set like a table or some other data from a database. The stream, of course, is just constantly moving. How do you deal with that? Is there a certain amount that's cached basically in memory as it's coming through and then it drops off when it gets too far and the new stuff comes in? Or how does that actually work?
Sure. There was a couple of I saw in the Q&A and the commentary. There was a couple of actually streams of conversation that were happening there. One was around real time, and the other one was in terms of how we kind of deal with very large data sets by streaming it through the workflow. And those are two different things. So if I take real time as a starting point, we don't really see ourselves as a real time analytics vendor. There are lots of people out there who are much, much better at doing real time in terms of how often they can either poll or directly really stream all of that real time data. I kind of make the analogy of, if you're in the railroad business, what Alteryx can do for you is help you optimize your network. We're not necessarily going to show you exactly where the trains are in your network on a moment-to-moment basis. And we're okay with that because, as I said, there's lots of people who are much more effective at the real-time aspects. We're much more focused on, providing an analytical platform where we're using specific data to get to a strategic business question. The second question was around, dealing with large data sets where we do actually have that in-memory database that we're able to take advantage of, as well as the fact because we are a workflow-based model, we can pass things through and take advantage of things like grid computing models for parsing data through in a parallel way as well as in a kind of a step-by-step way. So we can kind of deal with that in a variety of ways. It really depends on the volume of data that you're doing, whether you really want to do that or not. But we can certainly take a set of data and pass it through the workflow step by step, which kind of reduces the need to chunk it up. Or we can do data chunking if that's something that the organization wants to do. And at some point, it starts to be a question of, what's the hardware that you're applying and using to do this stuff, both in terms of the pipes involved on the infrastructure as well as the processing and memory power of the machine that's deployed upon.
Gotcha. Okay, good. I'll give you one more question. I'll give you, John, one question as well to close up. So one more question for Paul. One of the attendees, and I think you're going to agree with this, notes it appears that a big advantage of this particular tool is being able to connect to multiple data sets from various places and kind of synthesize all that stuff. I'm guessing you'd agree with that, right?
Yeah, I would, and again, it comes back to the purpose. You raised that point right at the very start of this, Eric, and I think it was a really good word to use, which is the purpose for us is to enable that process as part of a broader workflow, which isn't just about ETL, it's also about doing the analytics, but enabling that person who's in the line of business who I don't think has had the level of focus in terms of innovative capabilities over the years that maybe some other parts of it are, who doesn't want to have to wait for IT to blend together all of this data just for their one strategic analytical project. So that's what we're really about is taking that very good comment that came from your attendee there, but doing it for that business and data analyst. The data artisan, we believe, is absolutely critical to the success of organizations.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I think you're going to start seeing a lot more people really understand what that all means. And quite frankly, if you're out there listening to this either live or in the archive and you're looking for a new exciting career or some new direction to take your career, that whole concept of a data artisan really is going to be a high-demand job. I absolutely guarantee it, and you'll be able to make a lot of money and have fun. And that's a big part of being happy, it seems to me. John, I'm going to throw this last question over to you. It's a good question. One of the attendees is calling in from India saying, how can we use big data on tight budgets? And, of course, one of the nice things is there are a lot of open-source tools that you can use. Certainly a lot of these databases have open-source versions and even other applications on top that have open-source versions. Can you kind of speak to how someone with a small budget might be able to leverage big data?
Well, yeah, I think you're on exactly the right track. I think one of the drivers of many of the whether they be the Hadoop distributions or some of the NoSQL platforms that are in the open source was the fact that the license fee for a lot of the more mature, structured data center certified platforms was becoming, I wouldn't say untenable, but untenable for certain business cases. And the introduction of these open source platforms has really allowed other organizations to come up and do that. Now, just because the software is under an open source license doesn't necessarily mean that it's free. It's kind of like there's no such thing as a free lunch. A lot of times what you have to do is when you go with the true open source versions of these platforms is you have to give up a certain amount of operational functionality in terms of being able to operate the software. You're not losing any functionality within the software, but in terms of managing jobs, managing the platform, things of that nature. That's what a lot of the organizations that charge for their distributions, that's some of the value that they do for it. But definitely an organization that's on a budget can go to one of these open source platforms with an entrepreneurial mindset and really be able to do some good things in terms of both structure, speed, and the volume that they want to be able to use, and make sure that they can do that under a particular budget. So to the person asking, how do we do it on a budget? It depends on where you want to spend your dollars. Do you want to spend them in an operational perspective, or do you have the sweat equity manpower to manage the platform for yourself and then utilize the data that way?
Yeah, that's right. Okay, great questions from the audience. Great questions from you, John. Good presentation. Paul, I really do love what you guys have done with that user interface. I feel it's one of the most overlooked and underappreciated aspects of enterprise technology is just that layer through which you interact with the data and with the applications and so forth. And, you know, I definitely see what you guys have done as being a good archetype for how this stuff should be done in the future. And that workflow part of it is such a huge component of the equation. You know, the nice thing about this whole internet age and all this social media stuff is that a lot of these companies that have come out with these big products, like I mentioned earlier, Twitter and some of these others, really understand that the importance of workflow and of working through specific sets of tasks to get to a completed result. So you can see, folks, this month is cloud, next month is innovators, January is big data. Wow, a year has gone by. We're very happy to have had you in the show today. Hope to catch up with you next week. Actually, next week we have one. So hop online to InsideAnalysis.com for all the latest. And with that, we will bid you farewell. Speakers, stick around for a quick post-conference. Catch up to you next time, folks. Take care. Bye-bye.